Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to take a seat, we can start the meeting. Okay. Nessuno mi bada. Non si sente. Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me if you can take a seat. We are going to start the meeting. Okay. Thank you. So, I would like to welcome you to our event today. Thank you to everybody who has come to participate, and especially to our panelists who will be kicking off our discussion today. We have translation available in English, French, and Italian, so feel free to use the headphone to listen to whichever language is most comfortable for you. I will now switch over to Italian for the rest of the conference.
If we had to identify a decisive variable in the geopolitics and economy of the world during the last 15 years, we would inevitably have to look towards China. After a century of silence, China has once again started to make its voice heard. China acceded to the WTO in 2001, and that was a historic moment that really was a turning point for the global economy. Since 2001, China has progressively begun to gather the fruits of the cautious opening up that it started up in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, and it's now transformed itself in an economy of global dimensions. At the same time, China's geopolitical weight has increased, and we all see the results in Asia, in the areas near China, and also in Africa further away. In Europe, we face this year we still face the challenges that we weren't able to deal with last year, and among those there are two whose consequences will have a major and cross-cutting effect on the economic and industrial system in Europe. And here I'm talking about TTIP and China's market economy status. These two challenges are actually more linked than would appear at first glance. Today, we want to begin to reflect on the issue of the recognition of market economy status to the Chinese economic system. The importance of this change is so obvious that I think in itself it justifies the initiative that Mr. Martin, Mr. Morel and myself have made to bring it to the European Parliament. I'd like to point out that this is a divisive issue, but nevertheless there is a common front among the different political groups in the European Parliament. I think that's shown by today's event. The speakers that will follow will help us to analyse the various aspects of the problem, and we'll be looking at the dimensions of the issue, its probable consequences, and any possible responses. We wanted to look at the various aspects in play and base ourselves on two main questions which seem key. Firstly, should a market economy status be automatically given to China? And secondly, what if it is recognised, what should we expect for our industrial system? Now, quite apart from the technical aspects, whether legal or economic, it is always worth remembering that we have here two distinct and very different players who are, however, operating on the same planet. On the one hand, you've got Europe, many nations that are trying to become a single continent, and on the other, you have China, a nation that is actually a continent. I hope your work is fruitful here today, and let me give the floor to Emmanuel Morel. Thank you.
Merci, chers collègues. Thank you very much, Mr. Borelli, and Happy New Year to all of you. This will be an important year, politically speaking, for Europe. We wanted to hold this conference because the because of the state of current affairs, and perhaps you know that tomorrow there's going to be a debate in the Commission, and the spokesperson from the Commission has said that no legislative proposal will be brought out before this summer. We can see quite clearly the way that the Commission is thinking. We are looking at an ordinary legislative procedure, which means that the European Parliament will have its say. That's quite important for us, and that explains the reason for holding this conference. We have a view to give, and Mr. Borrelli quite rightly mentioned a joint front on this when it comes to looking at MES for China. This goes beyond the political groups. We need to look at how we can best defend the interests of the European Union as a whole. That's what's at stake here, and the point of this and shows the point of this conference the day before that debate in the Commission. Now, on my far left, I have Mr. Grésillon, who's he was a journalist for the French newspaper, the Echo. He lives in Brussels, but has spent the last 5 years in China, and has published a book on that, and shed some light on the economic model in China, one which is difficult to see. So it's difficult to see surviving a long term in the long term. The next speaker is Mr. Chiku, who's a member of the International Trade Committee and is the vice chair for relations with the Arab Peninsula. On my right, I've got Mr. Bernard O'Connor, who's a foremost lawyer and works for a lawyer's practice called NCTM, and has worked on a number of issues, the WTO, particularly in dispute settlement. I'll give the floor now to Mr. Grésillon and ask him to introduce this debate. It's a very important issue for the European Union, and I'd like to thank you all for coming today.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this round table. As you will have understood, I've only been back in Brussels since September. I'm rediscovering Europe, but I spent the last 5 years in China, where I was covering affairs for the French newspaper, the Echo. And I published a book in 2015, which the point of which is to explain that our view of China is mistaken and doesn't really fully understand the fragility of the economic model. The reason I wanted to speak here today is because I think that it's important that our view of China is more balanced if we are to look at this issue of market economy status. Quite often we think of China from a rather, or in the past we've thought of China as rather condescending, in a rather condescending way. We've overlooked some of the achievements in getting so many people out of poverty, for example, in the past. But something which is quite visible today is the impression that China can achieve whatever it wants, that it is the foremost power in the world, and we can do nothing to stop it from doing exactly what it wants. I think that this market economy status issue gives rise to three questions. We can look at it from an economic and technical point of view. Is China actually a market economy? We can look at it from a legal point of view. Should we give market economy status to China? Are we bound by the texts, legal text, to do it? And the third point is whether or not we want to do that. So here, I think the third one is really the most important. I'll deal with the first one first of all. On an economic and technical, from an economic and technical point of view, I think it's worth thinking about what we're seeing today. as things stand with the stock market in China collapsing, I think we can use that word, we're seeing something beginning to break down. We're seeing a bubble which is bursting. And it's a bubble which emerged after the crisis with the Lehman Brothers. If we look at what happened in 2007 and 2008, and what's happened since then, debt levels have increased exponentially. We are amazed by the trade reserves and the trade balance that China has, which is a surplus of billions of dollars. But if you look at the country domestically speaking, debt levels have doubled. And if you look at public and private debt together, this is comparable to developed countries, but China's state of development is much lower than that of developed countries. So I think this is a very dangerous situation, and that's basically a description of the facts of the current situation. Now, how did this happen? Well, money has been channeled into all kinds of sectors, particularly heavy industry. When it comes to steel and coal or photovoltaics panels, we can see that's the way that things have gone. The Chinese economy can the Chinese economy be classed as a market economy? Well, on the one hand, you could say, well, the Chinese companies have benefited from an unfair advantage. That resources need to be better allocated. It shouldn't always be large public groups which gain the financial benefits from the state. The monies are always channeled on the basis of political decisions to these large groups. But you could say similar things for the cost of land. If you're a public company, you're going to do much better. You can rent a few hectares to set up a factory at a relatively low price, because the relationship between these large state groups and political power was a very close one. From an economic and technical point of view, it's quite difficult to say that it is a market economy. There is another way of looking at it, and that's the legal way. Here, I wouldn't like to anticipate what's going to be said by the legal experts that are here, and I certainly don't have the necessary training to do that. But it's important to think about what our room for maneuver might be. There we need to think about the way that China works. China is a country with a very interesting philosophical background, and we can learn a lot from China. But their thought processes are different from ours when it comes to a whole series of things. We, as Westerners, now of course I'll just preface my comments by saying I'm not a philosopher, so I don't want to get into this too much. But basically, in the West we think about concepts, whereas in China they think more about where they're going at the moment. So when you sign a contract in China, for example, a French company signs a contract, a joint venture contract with a Chinese company, it could be that 5 years later things change markedly because the Chinese company changes the terms of the contract. Now, there, the French company would be up in arms because a contract has been changed. But in this Chinese way of looking at things, this is just a normal development. The world has changed, and therefore the contract should change as well. For them, that's quite clear. Now, this is something which I read in a book written by André Cheng, and he's a strong defender of China, a businessman as well. And I felt that was something that was important to outline. Chinese people are not going to sign up to an agreement which will then be set in stone. they would see that with changes happening in the world, then such an agreement would need to change as well. And of course, China's changed so much in the last 15 years that this is perfectly normal for them. So that's what I wanted to say about the legal aspect of it without going into the details of the text. Third point is whether or not we actually want to give China market economy status, MES. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, the only way of looking at things. That's the way that China deals with her partners. It doesn't really ask whether or not it's bound to do things or what the economic reality is. It looks at what its needs are and where it wants to go. Now, that's the strength of the Chinese system. It's essentially a long-term political approach, and that's the way we need to think as well. Now, I hope you'll forgive me if I don't get into a cost-benefit analysis of market economy status. I have an economic background, and I tend to think that it's very difficult to quantify these kinds of things. If we give market economy status, we might lose several million jobs, but at the same time, our basic products, raw materials will be cheaper, so we'll gain in competitiveness. These kinds of calculations actually are very difficult to carry out. And what I think here is that we need to make sure that we are thinking in the right way. It's quite clear that the people who want to speed up MES for China, it's quite clear that they think that they're going to gain in terms of China's view of them, that there will be an advantage for us. But we need to be cautious here. That's certainly not guaranteed, and recent history doesn't really show that by being nice to China, you will benefit in the long run. If you look at the way that the member states have dealt with China in recent years, they've bent over backwards in some cases, and China has just let them compete. But I've felt, as a Frenchman, that this approach by the French diplomatic services has gone too far and hasn't really led to any major advantages or any changes in the relationship, economic relationship, between China and France. Angela Merkel has been to China, and there she tends to take a harder line, and the made in Germany idea sells very well in China. In the Chinese mentality, there's quite a lot of respect for people who seem to be strong adversaries. The country which is most respected in China is the United States, because they tell it like it is. They're quite willing to take China head on, and the Chinese respect that. So we shouldn't think that we will gain more favors from China by simply giving them market economy status. There's also an idea that we might be bailed out by Chinese capital. Now, of course, this is quite tempting, but if we cut a deal like that, we need to be careful. We need to think about what we're giving up in exchange. Those who are looking to this talk about getting the right deal, but that's actually quite difficult to quantify. Things are essentially asymmetric. We've got a huge amount of transparency here. We can see what kind of divisions exist because of the way we debate things. And China is well aware of the divisions that exist within the European Union, but we know nothing about their internal divisions. And if that's the basis for a deal, it's going to be very difficult to get a good one. That's why we need to be cautious. When China joined the WTO, we thought that a number of sectors would be opened up in China, and it was true, but only up to a point. The devil was in the detail, and in some sectors, for example in finances, the sectors didn't open up. A bank can go and do business in China, but in reality it's so complicated when it comes to all the red tape that you can't really compete. If you speak to any banker about their business in China, you'll find that they've basically given up. They're there for political reasons because they feel it's important to have a presence, but they're not really under any illusions that they're going to be able to benefit much from being in the Chinese market. So we need to be very clear about what kind of deal we might get. When we negotiated in 2001, economically speaking, China wasn't really such a major power, but now it's the foremost economy in the world in some senses. I think that if we're going to address this kind of issue, we have to think of ourselves as actually being in the stronger position, as having the upper hand. What you see coming out of China is intended to give a view of power and confidence, but if you look at the economic overcapacity in the Chinese economy and all of the strategists and the president of China, they're very intelligent people, they have very much seen the need for markets outside China. They need us more than we need them. That's what I would say. So I'm not really sure that I can say definitively that we should or shouldn't give them market economy status. It's very difficult to quantify things, and perhaps it could be that we do have a lot to benefit, but a lot to gain. But we should tackle this whole issue cautiously and see ourselves as having the upper hand in a partnership. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Grésillon. C'était à la fois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grésillon. Well, that was very interesting indeed. Mr. Siku, you have the floor. 10 minutes or so, please.
Grazie. Buongiorno.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I apologise for my voice. I've got a bit of a sore throat. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Borelli and the other colleagues who wanted to organise this event. I think it's really very timely to hold a meeting of this kind now. Let me begin by repeating a little bit what Mr. Grésillon said. I.e., we need to reflect on this issue, we need to reflect on it in a balanced manner, and we need really to look at the situation in a careful manner. I mean, there are possibilities for Europe here. The IMF says that there are possibilities, there are 90%, that Europe could develop 90% worth of possibilities outside Europe. I mean, there is at the moment a closed market in China, but perhaps what is going on could actually rewrite the rules of world trade. Now, things have changed, I agree with Mr. Borelli, and I think there needs to be a bit of vision here, because it's vision that then ensures that sensitive issues can be dealt with and that opportunities can really be grasped. And I'm saying that because there are many elements that we need to reflect on. I mean, there are legislative, legal issues, political and trade issues as well. But most of these issues have already been noted. I mean, it's not as if we're starting a process now that started ages ago. I mean, what we need to do now is try and see how we've got to where we are today. I mean, how is it that we're discussing this today in the European Parliament? But to become aware of that, we need to try and see which elements we can actually bring out of the whole situation, and particularly those elements that take account of people's needs and requirements. I mean, obviously, we can't only just simply be protectionist about this. We can't simply think that, well, when it comes, for example, to TTIP, we should be governed by ideological aspects or just aspects that don't really look into the content of the agreement and therefore the effects of what's actually going to be agreed. So we have to be very careful in the way we actually look at all of this. I mean, I think what we need to do is begin by looking at what is actually in play here, because all too often there's a great deal of confusion as to what's going on. I mean, we're all awaiting a decision from the European Commission. The European Parliament doesn't want to take over any of the Commission's remit. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of my group, the EPP here. The European Parliament doesn't want to take over the Commission's role. So what the Parliament wants to do is to wait until the Commission takes its position. The Commission needs to make a proposal. It needs to decide. Obviously, however, we just don't want to sit here and wait. We want to ensure that we understand exactly what's being done. I mean, we are part of the legislative procedure. We're actually co-legislators here, and so there's a whole process to go through. I do have to say thank you to the Italian delegation as a whole on this, actually, because they have all together, or we have all together, asked Commissioner Malmström how Article 15 of the protocol on accession to the WTO should be interpreted. And Mrs. Malmström responded very clearly. She said there is no automatic market economy status recognition. It's not possible to have clauses that automatically confer any kind of market economy status on China. So I think that's an initial point on which we can base ourselves. So that means that the Parliament will be called to take part in the process and will also have a decision-making role, because there will have to be a qualified majority if the proposal does reach Parliament during the coming months. The other key element here is the fact that 5 years were asked for to award market economy status to China, but there are various problems now. I mean, for example, there are distortions that are being caused by Chinese companies, but there are other problems. I mean, it's not possible to really assess this situation properly. We don't have the instruments necessarily. So there is a whole series of things that we don't really understand. There's a whole set of knowledge that we don't have. And so, basing ourselves on all of that, you can see that geopolitics is also important. I mean, the United States are being very cautious on that. I think they're right on that. I think Europe has to be cautious as well and has to be very careful in what it does. I mean, it does have to be transparent in what it does. It's very important to see transparency vis-à-vis the citizens of the European Union. But I essentially think that we have to be cautious. We have to look into this much more carefully. I agree with what Mr. Grésillon said there. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of what might happen. I mean, this MES will have a major effect on our economies. It will have particular effects on certain sectors of our economies. But I think that it's because of that that the EPP is going to be holding hearings which will involve European businessmen, because we believe that if we can have specific and clear information based on specific markets and specific experiences, then we'll better be able to take decisions. I mean, this is part of the request that we made to Mrs. Malmström. We want to understand which effects would follow MES recognition. We don't want to sort of understand the effects in general. We want to know them much more specifically. We want to know what the effects will be on various sectors, what perspectives will be for various sectors. All of this is important when it comes to this kind of recognition. And I think that China needs to understand our point of view. China also needs to be cautious here. So we shouldn't feel that we're under pressure to decide anything, because this isn't about the one economy dominating another. What's in play here is the global balance of the new rules which will become part of the global trade system. So we want to be responsible in what we're doing here. We want to play a leading role, because Europe needs to have a leading role in global events. The elements which we base ourselves need to be clear. Now, I'm not going to go into this interesting article that appeared in an Italian newspaper, Il Sole 24 Ore. We've got an expert here who will be talking about that. I mean, there's an aspect that's contained in that article, i.e. anti-dumping, which is extremely interesting and relates very clearly to the current debate. But we've got an expert who will discuss that a bit later. So I'm going to conclude just by giving you some of the conclusions that the EPP, the European People's Party, has reached. I think each political group needs to express its opinion. So we don't believe that the concession of MES should be automatic. There needs to be a change in EU legislation. We need to change the 1209 from 2009. We don't believe that China fulfills the criteria to be a market economy status, and to ensure equality, the EU needs a functioning anti-dumping mechanism, which can also be used against China in the future if necessary. I don't like the word against. I should perhaps have better said in favour of the system as a whole. We need to find solutions that are in line with the WTO, so that we can bring anti-dumping cases against China if necessary in the future. So we can't basically limit ourselves to preliminary aspects here. We have to really get into the substance here. I mean, the system we have is far more complex than it appears when you just discuss recognition of MES. But we do have to be ready if market economy status were to be granted. Thank you.
Merci, chers collègues, pour cette explosion.
Thank you very much for that very clear presentation. You rounded off by saying what the EPP thinks about things. I'll not go through the socialist position on that, because, I think my colleagues are here as well. I'm sure we'll be hearing about it. But I think we're thinking along the same lines. Mr. O'Connor, I'd like to give you the floor now. You're an expert in this field.
My presentation today will really go into a little more detail of that which we have already heard. I could really have spoken the speeches of my the two precedent speeches quite easily, as I think they have both hit the point very well and made their points very well. I will use slides because I am a lawyer. I don't like slides, but it's rather complex, so I'm going to have to try and we're going to have to try and do this slide thing together. Okay, our first one. the very basic point that we heard from Mr. Gracillon. China is not a market economy. But there's a second point in this first slide, and that point is the point Mr. Gracillon made about contracts. China signed a deal in 2001 when it became a member of the WTO. And there are a whole series of commitments that China made. Now, China has made one or two of those, or has met one or two of those commitments, but it has not met the majority of those commitments. Now, the big one that it was supposed to meet was a promise that even though at the time, in 2001, China was not setting its prices according to a market economy system. Even though China was not a market economy, it promised back then, it made a contract back then that it would allow the system to develop, the Chinese system to develop, such that prices were made by the market. It hasn't. And it is that simple. And if prices were made by the market today in China, we wouldn't have this problem, because China would be a market economy in fact, where it is not. Okay, China is, and again to reflect what we've heard before, describes itself formally in the WTO as a socialist market economy. Now, a socialist market economy is not a Stalinist market economy or an old Eastern European market economy. It is a socialist Chinese market economy. Very, very detailed plans. You have heard of the overall 5-year plan. Well, there are 71 5-year plans. There are 21 sector-specific 5-year plans. Nothing is left to chance. Everything is organised. And here I've given you a list of all the sorts of issues that make China a non-market economy. So, legally, China is not a market economy as well. How do we know that? We know it because the Commission has told us. Now, we have had a number of formal inquiries set out by the European Commission which have not found that China meets our criteria for being considered a market economy. Now let's look at these famous 5 criteria that are set out. So, the economic resources, and this is a very economic point. We have a liberal market economy in which resources are allocated on the basis of how markets think they should be allocated. So if somebody goes bankrupt, it goes bankrupt. If somebody wins in the market, they win in the market. You like it or you don't, but that is our liberal market economy system. China does not have it. It means that resources, and resources means land, resources means energy, resources means capital, resources mean labour, are allocated on the basis of 5-year plans, not on the basis of the market. Now, have we removed barter trade in China? Yes. Do we have corporate governance and systems of corporate governance? And here we're not just talking about the type of boards that might run companies, but we're talking about very basic company law. We don't have a proper company law system in China. So we don't meet that, China doesn't meet that criteria. Property rights, real property, bankruptcy, competition law, antitrust law. They don't have it. They have introduced recently some laws which would appear to show that maybe they have it, but they don't implement the laws. So it's a fig leaf. And then, do they have an open financial sector? No. The banks are 90% state-owned banks and complying with state instructions. Okay, now we start going to this famous Article 15 of the Protocol of Accession, and we start looking at that. I mentioned first Article 9, which said that China should set its prices on the basis of market criteria. That is twinned with Article 15, because Article 15 applies until such time as China gets its act together and allows prices to be set by the market. we're going to have to look a bit at dumping. Dumping, you need to understand it to understand the Article 15. Now, dumping is fairly simple. What you look at is the situation in the country of origin, the price or the cost of production in the country of origin, and you look at the situation, the export price to the country of destination. And if in the country of origin it's higher and it's lower in the country of destination, you have dumping. It is that simple. However, we don't talk about comparing the price on the domestic market with the price in the export market. We talk about normal value. Why do we talk about normal value? Well, because in many situations, prices may not apply in the country of origin, even in a normal market economy. I will give you an example. Say if you have an industry which is dedicated only to export, well then you will not have a price in the domestic market, in the country of export. So we don't talk about price, we talk about normal value. Normal value is normally based on prices, but as I say, there are many instances, and this slide shows you why you don't use, and WTO law does not talk about the domestic price. It talks about the domestic normal value. Now, prices also can be distorted in the ordinary course of trade. And when prices are distorted, even in a normal market economy, what we are allowed to do under WTO rules is to construct the normal value. So in other words, to go in there and say, listen, your prices are all a bit messed up, and because they're messed up, because there are distortions in your market, we are going to construct the cost of production, the normal value. And this is what we do. And we are allowed to do it, and the European Union does it in relation to steel, in relation to fertilizers, in relation to biodiesel, whereby, let us take the example of Russia. Russia, we all know, has a controlled gas price. Gas is the main ingredient in fertilizers. So when we are calculating a dumping of fertilizers from Russia into the European Union, we do not use the local gas price in Russia because that is state-controlled and it's a monopoly price and there is no competition. But we use the nearest gas price we can, which is in White House in Germany, which is a true market price. And then when we reconstruct the price of fertilizers in Russia to get this normal value, we impose, in a way, an external gas price on it. Okay? We did that recently in relation to soya for the production of biodiesel in Argentina. In Argentina, the soya market is distorted because there's an export price, and because there's an export tax, and because there is a block on the exportation of soya, it drives the price down of soya in the Argentina market, and it's not a normal market price. So we don't use that, and we do it. Now, right now, the Commission considers that we can use non-China prices when we're constructing normal value from China. And it does it on the basis of two bases. One, it considers it's possible on the basis of Article 15. And secondly, it considers it's possible on the basis of this way we do it with Russia and Argentina. Now, sorry, I'm going in the wrong way. Okay. Now, the problem is today that it appears as though we cannot do it in the Argentina-Russia way, because it appears that there is a draft ruling from the WTO condemning the EU for doing this, what we call the cost adjustment system. We don't know this for definite, but there are rumours and there have been press reports that cost adjustment will no longer work because it is illegal in the WTO rules. That means for China, all we have left is this Article 15. There's Article 15. God bless you all if you can read it. You know, I've been reading this thing for about 4 years, and I still don't fully understand it. But that's the whole thing, so you can have a go at it. This article gives rights. It gives rights to China, and it gives rights to the EU. The rights it gives to China is under paragraph D. And China has the right at any time to demonstrate to the EU that it is a market economy. That's simple. The criteria against which China must show that it is a market economy are the famous 5 criteria of the EU. That's all set down. So China can do it for the whole economy, or it can do it for sectors of the economy. That's China's rights. The EU has rights under Article 15. Now, and this is where it gets a little more complex. What are the EU's rights? The EU's rights are to use China prices in certain cases and not to use China prices in certain cases. So, in the European Union, we call this not using China prices. We call it the analog country method. We go to a country that might be similar to China, and we take prices from there and we impose them on China. The problem is now that part of this Article 15 expires 15 years after China became a member of the WTO. China became a member of the WTO on the 11th of December 2001. Plus 15 years brings us to midnight on the 11th of December 2016. So, what happens when one part of this very complex Article 15 goes away, and what must we do? Here is the Article 15 shown with the bit that has been taken away or has expired, taken out of Article 15. And we can see, first of all, that there is nothing that says that China automatically must be considered a market economy. It's just not there. The word automatic or definitely or must or shall or all of those lovely legal words just do not appear in this article. What it does say is that importing members shall use either one or the other. So the first part, you can use China prices or you don't, remains in the article. Then the second part that remains, which is very important, it says, if producers can show that they are a market economy, then you have the right to use China prices. If they don't have the right, if they don't and they cannot show that they come from a market economy, then they don't have that right. It's that simple. China does not have the right to have its prices used for the purposes of the determination of normal value on the basis that it is not a market economy. And the Commission has found that it is not a market economy. Other countries have found that it is not a market economy, and that's simply the way it is. Okay. What's the Commission up to? And here I'll try and be very quick because I'm now on 14 minutes. I'm sorry. Very, very quickly. It seems, is the Commission trying to bargain something? If it is, we just don't know. Is it trying to bargain for something? Is it looking to try and get market access? We simply don't know. Is the Commission negotiating with our principal trading partners to see what the common interpretation of Article 15 should be? We just simply don't know. The Commission has not told us anything. And then think about this. What if the Commission was to propose giving market economy status to China, and this House and the other House of the Legislature, the Council, were not able to find agreement to actually grant this market economy treatment to China? What will happen? Well, eventually we will come to the WTO. And who's going to defend us in the WTO? The Commission. And the Commission will have proposed that we give it, and then it's going to have to defend that it's not given. Very quickly, let's look at the other countries. US, Canada, Australia. The most interesting one here is Canada. Canada gave it, and they'd said, oh, I made a mistake. And it took it away. So that's how serious this one is. I don't know whether that came through in the translation or not. I don't know how you translate ooh, but it is quite a shocking thing. The United States is not going to do it. Australia did it, and it cannot now use the anti-dumping instrument against China. It's that simple. And here I have some statistics, and you can look them up. Anti-subsidy is no alternative. Why? Because subsidies are specific, and they do not operate well in a socialist market economy. They do not capture the nexus between the state, between state-owned enterprises, between the Communist Party, between the banking system. And so anti-subsidy doesn't fully work for China. We need strong rules. Now, we need strong rules and we need the protection. Now here, I chose this particular quote from Adam Smith. Adam Smith, not usually cited in the Socialist and Democratic Party, I think. But look what Adam Smith said. Adam Smith recognized back 200 years ago that if you want innovation, if you want development, you must get your hands dirty. You must be doing something. It's by doing, it's by working that we innovate. And he had a very simple thing about a farmer and a plough right, a man who makes ploughs. And if somebody specializes in the making of ploughs, well, tomorrow they'll make a better plough. And if somebody specializes in the farming and ploughing and has to do it every day, well, every day they will think about how to make it easier for them to plough their land. And so manufacturing is essential for a market economy, as Adam Smith tells us. If we're really about jobs, innovation and growth, well, we have to keep good manufacturing in Europe. We have to keep innovation, to keep jobs. Now, we have, these are our, the Juncker things. We have different reports. One says 400,000, one says 3.5 million. But we lose a lot of jobs if we cannot use anti-dumping instrument to stop unfair trade from China. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Connor. That was very clear, very complete. Adam Smith, it's great to hear about him. He's not someone we hear a great deal about in the European Parliament. I mean, the Commission does inspire itself, is inspired by Adam Smith, but anyway, we're getting a bit behind here, so I'm going to be brief, particularly to prepare the transition to the next roundtable.
I think that what we've heard from the three speakers is that China is not a market economy, and everybody agrees with that. The real debate, and the one we're going to have with the Commission and also with some people here in the Parliament, is the whole issue to do with automatic granting of MES. My colleague from the EPP pointed that out very well, and what we want to do in the coming weeks is break down this myth about automatic granting of MES. There's nothing which obliges us to do that for China. In opposition to what's often said on the basis of technical or legal arguments. So the point of today's debate is to look at the political and economic aspects. And it's quite simple if you look at things in political terms, and I'm very happy to hear that on this debate we have got we've broken down party boundaries, because the only thing that's important is what do we as Europeans want. Secondly, what kind of Europe do we want to defend when debating this issue? And I've been reassured by what's been said by the speakers, because they've said that Europe has interests to defend. It's not an issue about values or about law. It's about interests. And if that wasn't the case, many of our citizens, whether they be from the left or the right, would be asking themselves, well, what's the point of having the European Union which is supposed to protect businesses and defend people's salaries and living conditions? If they're not doing that, what are they doing? And what we want to try and get across is that we need to have a European Union which takes a strategic approach, but also defends its interests using rules for international trade. Now, when we're talking about what kind of Europe we want, things are not very clear, and sometimes it seems that we're on automatic pilot. We see the debate between European leaders, and here Mr. Grésillon was quite right. China is a single bloc, a monolith going in one direction. But here, well, in the European Union, we've got a lot of transparency and diverging views. To date, Mrs. Merkel was in favour of greater economic relations with China. Mr. Renzi was against it. I think here what we're seeing is that the Commission hasn't really prepared its dossier enough. We are looking at, or we're hearing about purely legal arguments, but the real issue should be about economic and political priorities. And if we can gain agreement there, I think there are certain things which come out of the debate. Granting MES to China runs counter to one of our own objectives, which is having strong rules in globalization. As Europeans, what we defend is a certain idea of international trade, where there are rules and where protection is offered. And we don't get into some kind of race to the bottom when it comes to social conditions. We've got interests, we have European industry, we have the European economy as well, and we can't just sacrifice that in some kind of unfair competition. So those who are in favour of granting MES to China, and there are some, even in the European Parliament, what they're saying is that we'll give them MES and this will encourage them to carry out the necessary reforms. And there are some people in the Commission who are saying that. Well, we think differently. We think, and here I'm coming back to what Mr. Grésillon said earlier, we shouldn't be caught like a rabbit in the headlights. China has its interests, it has a different approach to the economy, and we need to remember that it's about a power balance. We have our position, China has its position, and we should avoid becoming a kind of global village idiot where we don't protect ourselves whilst everybody else is protecting themselves. So on that specific issue, if you look at Japan, the United States, Canada, or India, they've got no intention whatsoever of granting MES to China without trying to shape the way that it's done. They want to defend their interests, and we should be doing the same. It's not that we are throwing down the gauntlet to China, but what we're saying is that the European Union wants to promote and defend a certain idea of the way that the economy should work. So that's something which I think needs to come out of this conference, and I think will come out of it. Touching on what Mr. Chiku said, modernising the trade defence instruments, the TDIs, needs to be, or we need to get over the stalemate on the negotiations there. Given what's happening in the steel sector, we can see that a new, more forceful attitude is emerging, and we're going to hear about that later from Mr. Martin, and I think that needs to be followed up on. So aside from the legal issue, what I would say is this is a political thing. What kind of European Union do we want? What do we want to defend, and which way do we want the European Union to go in the future? And these are all questions we're going to bring up with the Commission, and ones that we're going to bring up with our fellow members here in the Parliament. And I think that this initial meeting offers hope, because it shows that members from different groups want to defend on this issue a certain idea of the European Union. And I think that's a very positive thing, because if we don't show that, at some point the European Union citizens will say, well, what is this exactly that we've got with the European Union? What use is it? So I think that we can really take a step forward here if we show that we are willing to defend our interests in this. We are now going to move on to the second panel. The speaker corrects himself. We're going to have a questions and answers session, so I'm going to open the floor, and now is the time for you to ask any questions if you have them.
Je vous en prie.
I have a technical question for Bernard O'Connor. Could you take back Article 15 on your slides? Yes. Point A. Oh, yeah, that's the slide that's difficult to read. So, but I will read it. This one. Yeah. So the second part will disappear, and in this part it is written that if the producers under investigation cannot clearly show that market economy conditions prevail in the industry, so this will disappear. Could this be, I'm not a lawyer, could this be, if this disappears, could it be interpreted that in future the burden of proof will be reversed, and that it's up to our sectors, our industries, our companies to prove that Chinese companies are not working under market conditions? Could this be the case? Could it be interpreted like this? Could this be a way out for the Commission to find a solution without giving the full market economy status to China? But of course, it's not working. It's not really working for European companies because lack of transparency in Chinese cost structures. But this could be a way out.
We know that the Commission is thinking of changing the burden of proof, but I would ask you to look at the first line of paragraph A1. If the producers under investigation can clearly show. Now, who are the producers under investigation? The producers under investigation are the Chinese producers of goods. How can you interpret a change of the burden of proof and say that the burden of proof should be on the European industry when the text clearly says if the producers in China can clearly show? It says that the Chinese producers must show. So I know that the Commission is thinking about this, but the Commission seems to be thinking a lot of silly things at the moment.
Good morning, my name is Stefano Feltri, I'm a journalist from Italy. I have a question basically for all of you. I would like if you can give us more details on who is supporting the openness to China. I mean, I suppose there are powerful interests working for opening the market mainly on commodities, on steel, and you were talking about Germany interest in this issue. So if you give us some additional details. Thank you.
Let me respond to that. I think you need to look. You can look at it in very general terms and very specific terms. In terms of those who would want an opening of the market, it tends to be those industries in the European Union which hope to get a better share of the Chinese market. And here we're talking about the ABBs, the Siemens, the larger machine tool industries that I want to do it. And they want it for two reasons. One is access to the Chinese market, one issue, and then secondly, cheap parts and cheap raw materials for the production of the heavy machine tools that they make. Then I think there is then those who would prefer it not to be seen are those companies in the European Union which are currently suffering from dumping. And the big dumping we have seen is in the steel sector, it's in the bicycle sector, it's in the ceramic sector, it's in the chemical sector, it is in a whole series of sectors which are currently subject are subject to dumping. And I would like to do it very, very quickly. I'd like to mention a product called rare earths. Rare earths used to be produced all around the world. China started dumping rare earths onto the world market. And everybody, all other producers other than China, went out of business. What did China do? It then upped and put in export barriers to prevent the export of rare earths from China out into the world. So this is a very clear example of how a dumping strategy works. You dump, you eliminate, and then you hold back. And this is what we see with rare earths. What we had to do in rare earths was go to the WTO. Bicycles is another good example. The European Union defended the European bicycle industry. America did not, or the United States did not. There is no bicycle industry in the United States. There is still one in the European Union.
Ma riprendendo un po' l'approfondimento.
Well, let me go back to what I said earlier during my presentation. I mean, I think it is useful to quote some data that has emerged from a study on the impact assessment. I think there's a study from 2015 that really says a great deal with regard to the question. The report states that conceding MES to China would produce a 25 to 50% increase on the 2011 level of Chinese imports to the EU. Now, GDP, there'll be a 1.2% reduction for the European industrial system, which would put at risk between 1.7 and 3.5 million jobs in Europe. And then there's the list of industries at risks, which includes car components, 1.2 million, the paper industry, 747 million, steel, 354 million, ceramics, 350 million, glass, 100 million, aluminium, 80 million, the glass sector, and then solar panels and chemicals as well. There'll be jobs lost there. So that's the data that we have. I mean, it's objective, but it's not sufficient. And so that's why I would go back to say that we do need to be cautious on all of this. However, this data does give some indication of the effects that might occur if MES was granted. And that's why, as I said previously, the EPP is not in favour of market economy status being granted automatically. Rather, we're in favour of caution. We want to ensure that all the elements that have been mentioned by Mr. O'Connor and other experts are taken account of. And we want to ensure that we can get over these technical and legal difficulties. Thank you.
Andrea Pila di Milano Finanza.
Andrea Pila, Milano Finance newspaper. I had a couple of questions, one more general and one for Mr. Grésillon. Now, the first question relates to the UK. It's one of the countries that we hear is pushing for MES to be recognised for China. And it's also one of the countries that has some of the closest relations with Beijing, and we've seen that during the last year. So how is that linked to Brexit? How much influence can the British position have there? And then a question for Mr. Grésillon. China's current model seems to be unsustainable, and It is, at least in theory, implementing a whole series of reforms when it comes to state-owned enterprises, ensuring there's more subsidiarity, and changing things in when it comes to governance, etc. So this could produce some changes that are useful to achieve market economy status, couldn't it?
Je vais vous répondre en français, ce sera plus simple pour moi.
I'll come back in French, that'll be easier for me. The whole point here is to think about things. If I say sometimes that we have a rather simplistic and mistaken view of China, one of the reasons that I say that is that I don't feel that we understand that it's not about whether or not China is aware of the problems, but about whether or not it has the means to resolve them. The path for the Chinese economy and the fact that it's running out of steam is quite clear, and something that everybody's been aware of, particularly amongst the new leaders in China. So the real issue is the feasibility of the reforms, and you can debate that with experts for hours and hours. The question of whether or not the plan set out for the Chinese economy will actually be carried out, though remains to be seen. The real problem with the Chinese economy is that its resources are not allocated efficiently enough, particularly financial resources. Now, when more that is done, more or less, then a lot of things will then, for that to be done, a lot of things will need to be done beforehand. So we're not going to see these major changes from one day to the next. And this is because the Chinese economic system is based on the idea that a centralized power controls most of the levers for the economy, if not all of them. And liberalizing an economy means giving up on that kind of control, the control of those levers. So the reforms being outlined now basically involve giving a bit of superficial power to companies, but it's still going to be the centralized government which is pulling the strings. When talking about the stock exchange in Hong Kong, for example, well, about 8% of of the financial resources of the state are placed on the stock exchange, but there's another 92% which aren't. So everything, I think, is a little too early to say.
I'm not a Brit, I'm an Anglophone. But in relation to this, I think you should look at the what happened in November, December. The United Kingdom is traditionally liberal in terms of its trade policy, but what you saw in November, December was the closure of a number of steelworks in Italy, in the United Kingdom, and you see that the United Kingdom immediately called for a special meeting of the Council and made very clear at that Council that the granting of market economy status to China without major compensation or mechanisms to ensure that the anti-dumping and anti-subsidy systems or the trade defence systems worked was not on the cards. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom has not told us what it thinks are these compensation methods, and the ones we've heard from the Commission don't work.
Ma semplicemente una riflessione anche di carattere.
Just a brief comment, which is political in nature as well. I've been to China around a dozen times at various times in my life as a private citizen and also in my institutional capacity. And when I was there, I looked around and I started to understand how a country's trade balance could be seriously affected by signing trade agreements with China. I mean, German cars, for example. And I think the UK trade balance is clearly favourable when it comes to China and its agreements with China. And that will obviously have a major influence on the position that the British government might take. I mean, obviously, some sectors do better in some countries, other sectors do less well. So there are some sectors that are going to need to compensate vis-à-vis the figures that I quoted earlier. But all of this doesn't really have much of an effect on Brexit, I don't think. There's not really much of a link. I mean, the UK will probably, as it always does, look at all this in an independent manner. I mean, it probably won't take so much account of the system, and I think perhaps it should take more account of the system. I mean, I don't think we should simply be protectionist about this and look at our own narrow, specific interests. I mean, obviously, all of us represent the citizens of our country in the European Parliament, and the interests of our constituents have to be taken account of. But I think we should perhaps have a more wide-ranging view, and I don't think the UK should limit itself to having a narrow view of potential consequences.
On a juste le temps pour une dernière.
We've just got the time for one last question before we move on to the next panel. Please go ahead, sir.
Good morning, Gianluca Di Donfrancesco, Il Sole 24 Ore, Italy. I understand you are here to state the official position of your parliamentary groups. So my question is, in your opinion, where is the majority in the parliament and in the council? Against or for granting China of the status of economy of market economy? Thank you.
D'abord, j'ai précisé.
Well, I said earlier that whilst my colleague here was speaking on behalf of the EPP, that I preferred to reserve my comments because there's no real official positions here. The feeling that I've got is that in the European Parliament, most of the members at the moment feel that the MES should not be granted automatically, doesn't need to be, and secondly that there are huge risks with this. Now, when it comes to the member states, well, perhaps things are a little less clear in the Council. As I said earlier, there are some countries whose position is quite clear. Matteo Renzi has already said what he feels. Angela Merkel is apparently in favour, but the trade unions in Germany are very active on this and are beginning to mobilise. Things there are therefore not very clear. And in France, well, the whole debate is just being kicked off now. There are some sectors in France which feel that it would be good if China was given MES. I'm thinking about banking and insurance, because they naively believe that once it has MES, then the markets in China will be fairly opened up as if they might be in a standard market economy. I feel they're very much mistaken, but it's just the initial hesitant steps of the whole debate in France. Here, what we are trying to do on the eve of the Commission's meeting is understand where the power balance lies. The Commission seems to be taking a rather strange fatalistic approach, saying, well, the rules are what they are, and basically either we're going to have to accept things or find some kind of intermediate solution, in the words of Mrs. Wikström. That would be a differentiated solution depending on the sector in question, but I think there are a lot of risks inherent in that. you know roughly the way things stand in the Parliament, then things are a little less clear in the Council. But what we have to do, it seems to me, is convince the Commission about what it should do, and that will require an awful lot of energy and input.
Bien, écoutez,
Okay, well, we don't have much time. Thank you for all of the speakers, and thank you particularly to Mr. Grésillon and Mr. O'Connor, because I think that they gave us a lot of food for thought and statistics and facts, and we need that. And I'm going to hand over the floor to Edouard Martin now, and we're going to look more at the industrial aspects of this question. Thank you then to everybody who took part in this first panel.
En fait, les paroles...
Je pense que c'est bon, techniquement.
Okay, I think we're all set up technically, so we can start. Okay, let me welcome you here. Thank you for being here, like my colleagues did this morning. Also wish you a very happy new year, a very dynamic new year. A year that will see us defending our European model against the criticism it all too often faces. And we'll start doing that by discussing this issue of market economy status for China. So prior to opening this panel, I'd like to reassure those who perhaps are a bit surprised here. What we're not trying to do is hold China to account here. We're not trying to put them on trial. We're not trying to say who's good, who's bad, etc. Quite the opposite. I mean, the first panel was about the trade aspects of MES for China and international rules, and I think they did it in a very good, neutral way. What we're trying to do here is diagnose the issue, and then following our diagnosis, we'll try and decide what we think. I mean, I believe that once we share the diagnosis, once we agree on what the problem is, then it's easier to find solutions. I mean, there are expectations around at the moment. There are people who see this as utopian or Machiavellian. No one really knows exactly what the consequences might be for the European economy if MES for China is recognised, etc. So now we have the second panel, and what we're going to be trying to do is that there are already repercussions and there are dangers for the future of European industry. I mean, we're going to be discussing, for example, what's going on in the steel sector in Europe, particularly as a result of unfair competition coming from China. And I think these are clear facts that really will give us a handle to get hold of. So before launching the panel, however, I'd like to present our speakers. They're all going to be giving their opinions and pointing out some concerns that exist. Here to my right we have Mr. Guido Nelison, who represents the European Trade Union Industrial. Then we have Mr. Battier, who is the representative of Ceram Uni and Aegis Europe. He represents the ceramics industry. Then to my left here we have Mr. David Borelli, a five-star European member, a member of the European Parliament, who comes from Italy. Italy is a very industrialized country which is facing serious competition from China. And let me just recall that the report that I tabled in Strasbourg, which was voted on last year, was supported by Mr. Borelli and his colleagues. And we also await Mr. Claude Turmes, who will be joining us. He's from Luxembourg. He's a member of the Green Party, and we'll be hearing from him as well. So I'm going to talk about the steel industry, but prior to doing that, let me just mention that I'm a massive football fan. I don't know how many of you know that. And yesterday, Lionel Messi was given the Ballon d'Or, the golden ball, for the second year in a row. Now, why am I saying that? Well, because football is an international sport, and anyone who wants to play football, wherever they want to do that in the world, they have to play by the same rules. Leo Messi wasn't given the Ballon d'Or because someone decided it in some boardroom. He wasn't given fake penalties. It wasn't that referees were on his side. He was given it because he is technically excellent and an excellent footballer, full stop. And it seems to me that Europe seems all too often to make debates that are actually very simple, far more complex than they should be. I mean, the question that we face is, does China play by the same rules of international trade as we do, yes or no? And the answer there is obviously no, as we heard during the first panel from our different speakers. As I said, I'm going to be talking about the steel industry, and I will be saying that technically and legally it's often very difficult to prove that there's dumping going on, particularly when it comes to Chinese products. And I think the steel industry is a really very good example of that. Mr. O'Connor mentioned earlier that if there is dumping, you have to prove that export prices are lower than prices within the country accused. I mean, that's the situation when it comes to a market economy, but the fact is that currently China is not a market economy, and that makes it very difficult for the steel industry to prove what's going on. I mean, okay, the Chinese are selling their steel for export more cheaply when they export it than they sell it internally, but we have to prove that. So the point is here that the Chinese have to explain to us how they managed to sell hot-rolled steel and how they can sell a ton of that more cheaply than they sell a ton of basically steel waste for. I mean, this is a Chinese miracle. They sell this stuff that has been worked on more cheaply than they sell scrap for. So there's something that you can see that it doesn't work there straight away. For several years now, we've seen steel prices going down. They've even halved over the next few years. I mean, this hot-rolled steel used to sell for over 400 euros per tonne. It now sells at 215 euros a tonne. Many businesses have seen their orders go down. Many businesses can't even take orders because they're producing at a loss. We heard the question on Brexit early on from the Italian journalist, and why Britain was in favour of awarding MES to China. Well, the number one victim of this unfair competition from China is the UK, because their steel industry is really suffering. Jobs are disappearing, and that's a direct result of dumping and the prices being foisted on the world by Chinese steel producers. There's more and more concern here. Turnover is going down, and as a result of that, many businesses may simply be forced to shut down this year because they can't compete with China. I mean, we talk about China actually, but there's more than one China here. We should talk about China in the plural, because there's your wealthy China on the coast, and then there's a sort of hinterland which is poorer. I mean, China is a country that has taken 500 million of its citizens out of poverty, but in spite of that, in China, workers barely have any rights. I think standards are far closer to the third world than they are to European standards. Workers work very high. Workers work very long weeks. Working conditions are pretty poor. Salaries aren't high. Overtime's not high, not paid for, and pensions are a problem. So there are problems here. Now, the steel industry trade unions have been raising the alarm on this now for a while. We've several times raised the dramatic situation vis-à-vis the steel industry. I mean, it's the same for other industrial sectors, actually. Mr. Battier will be talking about ceramics in a few moments. But when it comes to market economy status and negative impacts on the steel industry, well, some people say that China is or could be the workshop of the world. Well, people who believe that highly qualified workers could, or highly qualified jobs could go to China are completely wrong. I mean, we can see that Chinese consumption is going up a little bit. You look at trains, aviation, road infrastructure, the IT sector. There are more and more qualified workers appearing in China. So I think the fact is that all industries should be worried that China's going to gain more and more market share during the coming years. I mean, I don't think we can guarantee that highly qualified jobs will stay in Europe. I mean, it's been said that Europe is very naive in the world. It's the SWAT in the WTO, as it were, the good student. It does everything it's told. Let's take the example of solar panels. I mean, we go on and on about renewable energies. Yesterday I heard promotions, solar panels being promoted. But the fact is that over 80% of solar panels sold in Europe now come from China. They come from China because Europe doesn't impose any constraints on the import. There's no obligation when it comes to the origins of solar panels. I come from France, and France is pretty proactive when it comes to developing solar panels. But when you have calls for tender, it doesn't put any it doesn't include any conditions when it comes to the provenance of these solar panels. And so in France, we often see that tenders are won by producers of solar panels that come who are Chinese. So I think we need to review our rules as well and our trade defense mechanisms. I mean, tens of thousands of jobs in the steel industry are now threatened. We're seeing partial employment now in several businesses. Investments are being frozen, and many people are now saying that they're giving up on the idea of developing in Europe because they will never, ever be able to compete with China, which competes unfairly. So I think at a certain point we will have to demonstrate that Europe isn't the cause of any of these problems. It should, however, be part of the solution. I mean, like the Americans, and I very much appreciated that comment that we heard, we need to stand up to the Chinese. We need to say that we're not afraid and that we want to impose our fiscal, economic and social model. I mean, that's what the United States is currently doing. And I think we're far from actually reflecting reality in the responses that we're trying to provide to this situation. I was talking to the Dutch Minister for Economic Affairs yesterday on the emergency situation in the steel industry just yesterday. And Mr. Komp's response was that we'll be discussing competitiveness on the 16th and 17th of February in Council. And we won't be talking about they won't be necessarily talking about the steel industry. They'll be talking about competitiveness in general. So you can see how vague all of this is. So the question is, why is it that when we talk about China, when we try and come up with certain criteria, I get the impression that some members of state and some members of some member states and some members of the Commission are afraid of doing anything? Is it because the Juncker plan needs investment and financing, and so Europe may well be seeing Chinese funds coming in? So are we going to bow and scrape to China so that we can get the funding we need? I mean, which advantages, or how would Europe benefit if the Juncker plan was funded by the Chinese? And above all, how could you compare these advantages with the disadvantages of granting China market economy status? I mean, in the steel industry, we're talking about 400,000 jobs. So we need to hear how European steel producers will be able to compete with Chinese producers who are selling hot rolled steel more cheaply than scrap. I mean, Europe really needs to take account of how serious the situation is. We don't think that Europe is providing appropriate responses at the moment. We don't think that politicians are up to the challenges that are being faced by the real economy, and I think there are major dangers that we face. I'm running out of time here, but I would like to come to some kind of a conclusion. I mean, it's not really definitive, but I would just like to say, as part of this panel discussion, and I'd like to give you a clear case. The company Attali, which we visited when we were drawing up a report on the steel industry, and they produce very high quality stainless steel. And I'd also like to talk about the ThyssenKrupp, the steel business in Italy, wanted to purchase Attali because it is one of the leaders in stainless steel, so the merger would have made sense. But the Commission blocked the merger because it would have given ThyssenKrupp a dominant position on the European market. So that's just an example of the situation at the moment. And I think if we meet members of the Commission, we need to stand up and we need to tell them we're not in a European situation here, we're in a global situation. The Commission has weakened Attali, it's weakened ThyssenKrupp because it could have been a leader in stainless steel on the global stage. But the fact is that the Commission is simply closing its eyes to this situation. China has a 50% market share when it comes to steel globally. And so if China is given MES, then all the European treaties can simply be scrunched up and chucked in the bin, because we want to see free and fair trade, and that's not what China's involved in now. Let me now move straight on to our next speaker, Mr. Nelissen from Industrial. He's going to tell us what trade unions think about the situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I'm representing Industrial Europe. It's the trade union organizing 7 million workers. In the meantime, a bit less, because since the onset of the financial crisis, we lost 4 million industrial jobs in Europe. But we are representing 7 million workers in the whole of industry, included mining and energy. The only sector we are not organizing is food and beverages, but we compensate this by after work. We support this sector after work, mainly. But for us, this is an issue which we are very much concerned about, because granting market economy status to China could have devastating effects on our industries and could be the end of a number of our sectors. We think that if we grant market economy status to China, that within 2 decades there will be no production of primary aluminium anymore in Europe. There will be no production of steel anymore in Europe. That's what we think about it. On the other hand, for China, it's self-evident that they receive market economy status. For them, it's not a discussion. For them, it's clear. If you read their statements, it's clear for them. And they are taking a very aggressive stance here. And we are a bit impressed as Europeans. And we listen politely and we accept. And if China wants to take its cooperation with us seriously, it should not should not take such an aggressive position, I think. Especially not because China didn't live up to its commitments it made at the time when it signed this accession protocol. It was mentioned already by Bernard O'Connor in the previous session. He was making reference to Article 9 about introduction of a price mechanism, but the other provisions in the accession protocol are not respected by China neither. It's about state aid, it's about subsidies, it's about export restrictions, it's about opening up of public procurement markets. So China didn't live up to the commitments it made 15 years ago. So why being so aggressive in demanding this status? This is our trade deficit with China, and it's now 4 times higher than 15 years ago. And our Chinese imports are twice as high as our Chinese exports. Granting market economy status to China will mean that this trade deficit will grow exponentially in future. And at the meantime, this table shows also the impact of a new economic power in the global economy, the impact a new economic power has on the rest of the global economy. A new economic power that doesn't play by the rules of a market economy. It's a state-led economy which is entering the global economy, and will impose its own sets of rules, its own standards, and it will, in fact, make difficult the survival of our social market economy. Because it will impose its own rules on the rest of the global economy as a result of a state-led economy. So nowadays, here you see industrial production in Europe is going down because of the crisis. In China, it's steeply growing, and nowadays China is producing more industrial goods than we are. So that's how the global economy is changing. Then one of our main problems today in Europe is that we have a huge investment gap, 15%. Investments are now 15% lower than before the financial crisis. And here you see where the investments are going to. So to China. So where we are now, our capital stock is shrinking, and it's growing in China at a very high speed. So this should be reversed, but then we need the tools to do it. Then we have the case of steel. The left column is Chinese steel production, crude steel. We compare here 2003 with 2013. In 10 years' time, Chinese steel production has grown 4 times, quadrupled, while the rest of the world has remained stable. This has as a result that in 2003, China was producing 20% of global steel production. Now it's producing 50% of global steel production. So that's why I said within 2 decades, there will be no production anymore of steel in Europe. And this is, would China have been a market economy, this would not have been possible. It's only because it is a socialist, they call it a socialist economy, but in fact it's a state-led economy. If China would play by the rules of a market economy, this would not have been possible. Because China has not a comparative advantage in steel. It has to import its energy, it has to import its coal, it has to import its iron ore, it has to respect international prices. It's only because of this interventionism, this planning economy, that it was possible to quadruple your steel production in 10 years' time. Otherwise, it would not have been possible. So this puts a huge stress on this sector, but on many other sectors. The fact that China is a state-led economy. So the growing capacities in China with a market that's not growing at the same pace means that today that China starts to export steel. In 2000, it had a slight trade deficit in steel. Now it has a trade surplus in steel. But if you look here, the consumption of steel in China and the production of steel in China, there's a huge overcapacity, which is equal to the full European capacity. So China can nowadays easily take over the full European market without any problem, by just making use of its existing capacities. Yeah, and it was already referred to by our chairman, the collapse of steel prices, minus 50% in 2 years' time. So, but another interesting one conclusion here is that at this price, not only our companies are working with deficits, with losses, but also the Chinese companies are working below their own transformation cost. Also, the Chinese steel industry is making losses. But for them, it's not a problem because it's they are state-owned companies. They are too big to fail. There was one high-profile case recently, Sino Steel. which defaulted on its bonds, and it was saved by the government, because the governments, they just take over the bad assets and the company can continue. They cannot go bankrupt. And this means, in fact, that when Chinese companies can continue functioning even when they go bust, this means for us that China is exporting its own restructurings to Europe. One of the consequences is 5,000 jobs lost in the UK steel industry in 2 months' time. Because Chinese steel companies cannot go bust, they continue producing. The other conclusion of this slide is that the bottom line, the lower line, that's the export price of China. The higher line is their market price in the internal market. And still export prices are lower than their internal market price. So this means there is some margin of dumping, but it has become very small. If we grant market economy status to China, it will be, and we have to use Chinese internal market prices, then we cannot start anti-dumping cases anymore against China. That's the consequence of MES for us. Then, then it's about the legal aspects which were discussed in the previous panel. I skipped this. So yeah, for us, China is by far not a market economy yet. So they have made some progress, but the way to go is still very long. There are all kinds of restrictions. It's about state control on foreign direct investment. It's about restrictions on export of rare earths. All kinds of trade restrictions. It's all kinds of indirect subsidization of the industry because of this collusion between companies, state-owned banks, the government, and so on. There's all kinds of in-kind support, which is difficult to measure, free use of land, for example, and so on. There's no transparency at all in subsidy schemes. And yeah, it was already mentioned by Bernard O'Connor about the state intervention. I don't go in detail here anymore. Stated the plans and so on. For us as a trade union, it's also important that China has signed up to only 4 of the 8 core labor standards in ILO core labor standards. They have signed up to the core labor standards regarding equal treatment of women, child labor, forced labor. But even here, they do not respect the standards they have signed, because in China it's possible that workers are moved against their will from one region of China to another region of China. They are forced to do it. But there is no right to organize, no right to collective bargaining, no right to strike in China. And of course, environmental rules in China, there's a much loose approach of the environment in China. So giving market economy status to China also means that we increase the global ecological footprint. So, and this was confirmed by a recent report made by the World Bank. A quote about state intervention in China, and the conclusion is that these interventions have no parallel in modern market economies. So also the World Bank agrees that China is by far no market economy. And the second quote is that this leads indeed to wasteful investments, excess capacities, and weaker loan portfolios for the financial sector, which of course has also an impact on the external world. Then the topic of this panel, the macroeconomic impact. It was already referred to, this study made by Professor Scott from the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. I must admit, it's a quite rudimentary study, but nevertheless, it has its merits. So his starting point is that when we grant market economy status to China, then the average dumping margin will be reduced from 40 to 10% on Chinese products. If the dumping margin is only 10%, then there's almost no risk anymore for launching anti-dumping complaints against China. This will lead to a decrease of Chinese import prices on our markets, and as a result, when you apply price elasticities on goods, this will result in an increase of Chinese imports between 25 to 50%. And then the conclusion is altogether direct jobs, impact on the supply chain, and then indirect impacts because of the negative multiplier, because our GDP will go down. Altogether between 1.7 million and 3.5 million jobs that could disappear. And then on top of that, more jobs are at risk in a number of sectors that are of strategic importance of China, because China wants to make progress in this sector and it's investing very much in these sectors. Steel is one of them, and ceramics as well. And that's the calculation they made. So for this only the manufacturing sector, it's about between 200,000 and 400,000 job losses in the textile industry. It's about 145,000 and 290,000 jobs in the electronic sector. It's about 90,000 and 180,000 in the furniture sector. Basic metals is only between 20,000 and 40,000, but here the survey said that in these sectors, which are high-profile sectors for China, the job losses could be much worse. And one of these sectors that are of strategic importance, it's about aluminium, it's about glass, ceramics, steel. So here the impact could be much higher. These are the jobs at risk. It's not they didn't reveal how much of these jobs will effectively disappear, but in these sectors the job losses could be much higher. But then there are other surveys. Another one here, it's a study made about the past, about history, the impact of higher import penetration in the US between 1999 and 2011, about more than a decade. And also here they came to a conclusion that 560,000 direct manufacturing jobs, 420,000 with the suppliers, and then additionally 1 million because of multiplier effects. Also here, the growing import penetration of China in the US would have would have led to 2 million redundancies. And this is more or less in line with the previous study, which has been made by the Economic and Policy Institute. And it has also had a negative impact on wage developments and, of course, on public spending on social transfers. Perhaps Aegis has concluded that there are, on basis of the existing anti-dumping procedures, 300,000 jobs are concerned. Then perhaps I will, the arguments in favor of MES, they were addressed in the previous panel. So to conclude my presentation, so what's our view? How we are looking at it? So China is not a market economy. It's too early for upgrading China to market economy status. China must, first of all, honor its commitments it made at the time when it joined the WTO, so meeting the technical criteria. If these criteria cannot be met, it's up to China to show that individual sectors are operating in a market environment. Otherwise, we must maintain our right to use non-market economy methodologies. And this expiration of this article, there's no automaticity. And we think, in contradiction to the Commission, that if we grant market economy status to China, that would remove any incentive for China to move from a state-led economy to a social market economy. And it will lead to persistent imbalances on global trade markets in a number of sectors because of overcapacities, artificial low prices. So we have to do it in coordination with the other trading partners, with the US. We are negotiating TTIP with the US, and there we have a chapter on regulatory cooperation. Everything that has to do with international trade has to be discussed first with the other party. So we should discuss this because of TTIP. And also we think that is not really an alternative. It was also mentioned before. We don't believe in all the other proposals that have been launched, cost adjustment procedures, lifting the lesser duty rule, and so on. We don't believe that these are really solutions. Then finally, we want to keep a strong industrial base. We have launched this objective of 20% share of industry in GDP. MES is not contributing to this. We cannot accept that China is exporting its own restructurings to Europe and that European workers have to pay the price for MES, and that because of MES the global carbon footprint increases because bad companies with a high carbon footprint will drive out low companies, and so we want to create a level playing field between us and China, and this means that China must move from a socialist market economy to a social market economy. And so I admit this is a very technical issue, very legalistic, very complex, and politically very sensitive. But to me, economically, it's very clear. China is not a market economy, and it doesn't deserve MES.
Merci Guido.
Thank you, Guido. It's very interesting to hear from somebody who's representing the European Union's workers with facts and figures as well. And without further ado, I'll hand over to David Borrelli to give his point of view.
Voglio ringraziare ancora una volta.
Well, let me once again thank all our participants. I mean, it's good to see so many people here. And the fact that there are so many people here really shows what a timely discussion this is here in the European Parliament. And I'd once again like to thank Mr. Martin and Mr. Morel for having, together with myself, organised this important meeting on this very important issue. Well, we had our first panel, and I think what emerged from that is that this is a very complicated argument with many aspects to it. And there are major consequences to what's going on, given the size of the two players. I mean, it's quite right that politics deal with all aspects in play, but its number one task is to safeguard a general and full view of the problem, to act in favour of the common good. What we should avoid as politicians is simply defending one point of view or one side. So because of that, I want to briefly discuss the basic context on which these discussions are taking place. China is now a global player, and its distance from Europe is really basically relative now. And that means that we have to work with Beijing and support its economic, political, social and environmental development. On the other hand, however, the European Union needs to be aware that the choices it makes may well have irreparable consequences on our productive fabric. So what are European institutions doing given this context? What's going on when it comes to decision making among European institutions? I mean, how are we standing together to face up to this challenge that will have an impact on businesses, regions and our citizens? Well, the Parliament's moving, the Parliament's working, and you can see that from today's meeting as well. The Council, member states are blocked, as all too often happens, by subjective and short-term interests. And the Commission is simply doing nothing. We've reminded the Commission that time is pressing, but it's still doing nothing. We've asked the Commission for an opinion, data. We've recalled that it has a role in initiating legislation, but still nothing. Commissioner Malmström doesn't seem to have anything to say to the Parliament or to the citizens of Europe on this issue, which is going to be significant for coming decades, I would say. we're wondering what the consequences will be if market economy status is conceded to China. And I believe there has already been a consequence. We've seen that the Commission is unable to fully activate the European institutional mechanism in order to come up with a strong, shared and reasonable response. So we're seeing that decision-making in the European institutions is utterly inadequate. It's not up to the task given the urgency of the situation. It should be the Commission that's dealing with the technical and legal aspects that we're looking at today, but it's done nothing. Politicians, those members of the European Parliament who are here today, should have the task of safeguarding the interests of the general public. But unfortunately, we can't do that because all negotiations, all decisions are being taken behind closed doors. There's no information coming out. We're not against China per se. We're not against the intensification of trade and political relations with China. However, what we do want to see is that this takes place under fair conditions and under conditions of reciprocity in the interests of workers, citizens and consumers of the whole of Europe. The path towards reform in China is a long path that is ambitious, but that doesn't mean that we have to simply come up with positions and take decisions that it's then difficult to sustain. Because of this, we don't think that MES for China can be reduced to a simple legal issue, or even worse, become something automatic that has no legal or juridical basis. We believe that this is a very important decision, and therefore it's the job of politicians, and particularly the European Parliament, to take the decision. This is a point that opens up other scenarios. I mean, it is true that there will be a significant effect on certain sectors, and given that, we have to ask how Europe is going to deal with this twofold threat, this parallel threat, which will damage some sectors, but will actually be beneficial for others. Now, these aren't phantoms being dreamed up. The entire issue, particularly the legal, apart from the legal issues, revolves around the Chinese government's aim to try and get its industries to sell products abroad that they can't sell at home. Now, these aren't phantoms being dreamed up by European industry. This is an intention of Chinese authorities. The European Commission knows exactly what's at stake here and should be much wiser in what it's doing. Who's going to gain from market economy status for China among the member states of the EU, and which sectors are going to gain? When it comes to transparency, we're getting a lot of information on TTIP from the Commission now, but nothing's coming out when it comes to MES for China. Another issue is possible reprisals on the economic and political level from China. Jobs are at risk in the EU, and the Commission seems to be very concerned about that. So will someone stand up in the Commission and tell us how things are? Perhaps someone could tell us whether there have been meetings with the Chinese authorities to try and deal with this kind of issue. Perhaps the issue is linked to investments in the Juncker plan. I don't know. So we have these strategic situations, these scenarios, and in spite of the existence of those, the Commission is basically taking no account of them. It's basically hiding behind legal niceties. And the fact is that the EU could today complain about China to the WTO for the violation of at least 10 obligations that it committed itself to respecting in 2001 when it acceded to the WTO. Now, there are going to be various effects on individual sectors, as we've heard from colleagues, but there's something else that is also a major risk, which I would call the Schengen risk, i.e. the fact that Europe doesn't do anything may well push member states to taking an every man for himself attitude, which may well put agreements that are already consolidated at risk. I mean, this is something that we're already seeing happening to the Schengen Treaty, given the migration crisis. And this is something that may well happen with Brexit. With today's meeting, we, the members of the European Parliament, regardless of our political affinities, want to say that we reject this situation. Some people are hesitating, looking the other way, or fleeing, but while they do that, we want to safeguard the interests of our citizens and the businesses of Europe. We should be aware that on the other side of this, we don't have a nation, we have a continent. China knows full well that it is a continent rather than a country. I agree with what colleagues have said. We need to defend our trade interests, and I'm very pleased to see that the line that is emerging today is a pretty common one. It's something that most people seem to share. This is an important issue, and I think we need to take our individual interests off the table. We need to stand together, work together, and achieve results that can be beneficial for our continent. Thank you very much.
Merci David.
Thank you very much, David. Since we don't have much time, I'll give the floor to Claude Turmes, who's MEP for the Greens. Thank you very much, Edouard. And thank you very much for the work that you've been doing on behalf of the European steel industry, for what you were doing before you joined us here. I think it is important to try and build an agreement which crosses party boundaries. I'm going to try and keep my comments very short. About 4 years ago, I was involved in the General Assembly for Friends of the Earth, and this was the real point that they were trying to make, was the importance of the right kind of energy and industry policy. And their opponents were very clear in what they wanted to do, which was to do away with the steel industry. Now, the real problem is not the steel industry at all, because the figures show that what was happening was not actually coming out properly. If you go to speak to the politicians and you speak to them about their view of things, you'll see that they don't really fully understand. The genuine problem of the steel industry is as follows, and I told them 4 years ago. First problem is, what will you do when the Chinese economy slows down? This was 4 years ago, and very few people had understood what was happening in China, and that couldn't continue to grow at the same rate, despite its huge production capacity. All of the lobbyists and the representatives from the ThyssenKrupp and from Mittal were all there, and none of them had an answer or wanted to give one. And the second problem for some industries in Europe is that our domestic demand has fallen as a result of bad management. In 2009, after Lehman Brothers, so 2009 to 2010, steel demand fell by 50%, and we've never come back up to the same levels. So Mittal and other lobbyists are always telling us we need to be more competitive, we need to be more competitive. But have you understood that steel exports have increased in 2008, 9, 10 through to 2013, and with Chinese dumping, it's actually only recently that we're seeing problems. Before, there was no problem of competitiveness of the European industry in the world, except for with China. Now, that's one thing to bear in mind. The second point is that we need to reinvest in Europe. We need to modernise our infrastructure. Bridges, for example, need to be rebuilt. That involves steel. electric cables, electric lines, all of these need to be replaced. Yesterday, I launched a major program for wind farms offshore. We're talking about millions of tons of steel that we're going to need. So we need to do both things. Of course, before that, there is an emergency that we need to deal with, and that's the problem of Chinese dumping. We've got an internal paper which tries to look at what the Commission might do. We think that Canada has a wording on how to tackle China on this question of MES. I think there are three options. Is the European Union going to change the wording, leave it, or perhaps go along the same lines as Canada? So I think that between us as members of the Parliament, we should sit down and try and analyse things amongst ourselves. And of course, in politics, you have to build up your power. I know Jean-Claude Juncker very well. I know what ArcelorMittal is about and what Luxembourg is about. He has a very interesting approach to politics. He shouts a lot to begin with. So, for example, with the takeover of ArcelorMittal, to begin with, he said, "Never over my dead body." After that, he goes into hiding. You can't see him. He's nowhere to be found. And then after that, the second person was Krikke Frieden, and he negotiated in secret with the agreement concerning Charleroi Airport and Mittal, he did all the negotiations, and then Juncker comes back out of hiding to shake the hand and claim the credit. Why is he not doing anything about the Chinese steel dumping? Well, the thing is that there are those who are in favour of the current position. Germany, for example. Why was it in favour of the situation with photovoltaic panels? If you go to China, you will see that in the factories producing PV panels, photovoltaic panels, you'll see that all the machinery is from Baden-Württemberg. So the industries producing the machinery for China has earned huge quantities with Chinese expansion. So they were already had their industries who were interested. And then, of course, there's the car industry, and they're very worried about China in the car manufacturing industry as well. So there are some people who are very much in favour of the current situation. Take the UK. What about Hinkley Point and the deal there to do with the nuclear power plant which needs to be built? The deal with the Chinese. The British have now agreed that China will build reactors which are 100% Chinese in the UK. And when the Chinese Prime Minister was there, they were also talking about the new runway in Heathrow, investment in Liverpool and Manchester. That's part of Osborne's policy because he wants to be Prime Minister, so it's a sop to the north. And then France. In 4 weeks, Holland sold off all of our nuclear future and promised to help the Chinese to get a license to build Hinkley in the UK as well. So we can't really make progress with this unless we talk about it with the Germans and the French and the British as well. They all need to be brought to the table. First thing that we can do, I think, in the Parliament is better understand where our power lies in the market economy status decision. There are 2 or 3 options, and I think most likely will be in co-decision. if the Commission decides to make an alteration to something. So we need to make sure that we are ready and see how we can best build our alliances. Second point is that this kind of meeting, which you've organised today, has to be done in Paris, in London and in Berlin with the players involved in the steel sector in these countries as well. At the moment, the Commission has probably been told by Cameron, Holland and Merkel not to shift its position, because those three governments don't know what they're doing on this issue of the steel. And one last point. I think that the Mittal and ThyssenKrupp, or the employers in this, can they really be seen as Europeans? Do they really want to win here? When it comes to Mittal, I'm not too convinced. And for the ThyssenKrupp, well, you know that they've lost billions recently in building a plant in the United States and a plant in Brazil. It's almost incredible. In order to earn money in setting up the plants, instead of using their own engineering, they subcontracted it to the Chinese, and then things went wrong. Can you imagine that? ThyssenKrupp, which employs some of the best engineers in the world for building rolling mills and so on, subcontracted the building of the plants to the Chinese, and they made a mess of the plants that they had to build in the United States and Brazil. And Thyssen have lost a few billion on that. It's incredible. We need to make sure that we're open and honest when debating these issues, and we also need to stop thinking that we're combating or harming the environment somehow. If you look at ETS and the way that's being run, Mittal put a plant in Luxembourg on standby so that they could benefit by transferring the certificates. We need to change the ETS to modernise what we've got by giving money. I mean, here we're talking about state aids, but in exchange, we need to have an efficient sector. Your idea, Mr. Martin, of border adjustment, which we won in the Parliament, you have to remember there that Ball Steel has a better environmental performance than Mittal and Thyssen. The most efficient steel plant in the world is in Egypt at the moment. Why is that? Well, because it's a greenfield investment where we are modernising old machinery. We need to be honest about this as well, and about environmental considerations. So I think the only way to make progress is to reinvest in Europe and use the Juncker plan for that as much as we can, and then modernise the existing tools that we have by building into the ETS a system which collects money, and in exchange the steel lobbies have to stop saying that they're not willing to countenance any restrictions whatsoever, because that will kill off border adjustment.
Merci Claude, mais tu auras remarqué que...
Thank you, Claude. We're not here to defend the interests of Mittal. We're here to defend European industry, European workers, the economy in general. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Battier. We don't have a great deal of time, alas. At 12:30 we have to leave the room, and we do need a few moments for a question and answer session. So if you could take 10 minutes, Mr. Battier, we'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je remercie d'ores et déjà les députés Borrelli.
Well, I'd like to thank the members of the European Parliament, Mr. Martin, Mr. Morel, Mr. Borrelli, Mr. Turmes, for this excellent event. It really is very, very good, and it's very good to discuss the message that the European Union could send out by awarding China market economy status. Well, from the industry, I think we'd say it's a devastating message. I mean, we'd say, you'd be saying to industry, well, we might be the best when it comes to environmental protection, CO2 emissions, for example. We're asking you to reduce your CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050, but we're basically leaving you to your own devices to stand on your own 2 feet when it comes to the legality of trade. That's the message that the European Commission, the European Union would be sending to industry. Unfortunately, my Chinese vocabulary is better in English, so I'll switch to English.
Well, I have to mention that I do not represent today the ceramic industry, not only. I was invited to represent the whole Aegis Alliance, which is a very broad alliance of 30 industries. So I don't know if I can, I have to change the slide myself. Yeah. So you can see here that we represent 30 different industries. It's a very, very broad coalition that are all concerned, all share exactly the same fear and the same concerns in this field. So that gathers together the steel industry, which is also very committed to this cause. I don't know about Mr. Mittal, but I know about Eurofer, and I can tell you that they are committed. The aluminum industry, fertilizers, ceramics, ferroalloys, wood furnitures, papers, many, many, many industries, almost everything that you can imagine, and who are basically the big majority of the current users, so the industries that have been using the trade defense mechanisms over the last years. Altogether, they represent 500 billion euros of annual turnover and millions of jobs in Europe, direct jobs. And they are, of course, central to the EU's sustainable growth and innovation. So, of course, as you can see from this debate, it is a huge discussion. A lot of interests are at stake. It has already been widely reported into the press. These numbers that you heard today have been reported for several weeks. And what is it all about? So it is about, of course, granting automatic market economy status. You have heard this morning that most actors do not think that this should be automatic. And for us, it is about, in fact, granting a license to dump. We think that granting MES to China would be just granting them a license to do dumping as much as they want, without any restrictions, without any limit. So what we want is to avoid unfair competition and safeguard millions of jobs in Europe. Now, I was asked to talk about the impact that this would have in a bit more details. And why exactly are we so concerned, all these manufacturers, all these European industries? We are concerned about, of course, the volume and the scale. And there are dumping practices from other countries. But when we talk about China, it is a different story. What you can see on this slide is that China makes up to 50% of all EU anti-dumping cases. 80% of all EU anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigations are against China. And in fact, globally, not only in the European Union, they have increased, cases against China have increased by 60% since 2010. We can also mention that illegally dumped imports from China represent a very significant share. This is what we believe in, a very significant share of EU trade with China. We know that the European Commission has recently answered in some parliamentary questions, alleging that in this trade with China, or dumped trade from China, would represent only 1.37%. But in fact, this is really, really underestimated. This number does not take into account, for example, the cases that were not closed by duties, but that were closed by an undertaking. And the best example is the solar panel. This was not closed by duties, and in itself, before the imposition of duties, this represented 7% of trade with China, I mean, of imports from China. So that explains why, and I can also mention, which is a very relevant number, that since 2014, in 2015, imports from China have increased by 18%. And our EU trade deficit has increased by 30%. So this is not on the slide, but it's an additional number that you can take. That represents 40 billion euros. So this is the scale and the volume. Now, you can see a list, and I don't think you can read it, but you will have a copy of the presentation. You can see the broad range of industries that are concerned today by duties currently into force. Many products in the aluminum sector, several products in the bag sector, in ceramics, ceramic tiles and tableware, I will mention later. In the paper industry, in the steel industry, solar panels, chemicals and plastics, plywood, steel pipes, to mention just a few among this list of 50. What we are also concerned is, of course, the fact that, in fact, China is not at all a market economy, it's a state-run economy. You can find on the website of the Aegis Europe Alliance a study that has been made. It's a very long study by Professor Tobe, released in June in the European Parliament. And he showed that, in fact, over the last years, on the contrary, subsidies have been increasing, and the influence of state in the economy has been increasing rather than decreasing. And besides, we all know that there is a weak domestic demand in China, leading to a massive overcapacity. So it can only get worse. Yeah. Now moving to the impact, and I will be repeating some of the numbers that have been mentioned. We estimate that this decision to grant market economy status to China could result in a loss of between 1.7 and 3.5 million jobs in Europe, which would correspond to 1.2% reduction in GDP due to the increase in imports by 142 billion euros. So this is, we think that we can also add that, in fact, it can seem a bit exaggerated, but what you have to understand is that once one economy in the world starts being a bit stricter in the way it is defending its trade, the trade is diverted from China to another region. So we have seen it, all the ones that are involved in anti-dumping cases have seen it. First, maybe it will start in India. India will impose duties, and then you will have a big flow of imports that will be rediverted to the EU. The EU will impose duties, and then it will go to Argentina and Brazil. And then Brazil and India and Argentina will have to impose duties. So this is why there can be a big multiplier effect. What we also fear, because some of us fully support the current FTA negotiations between the EU and the US, what we also fear is that it could have, in fact, it's what the US fear, is that if the EU opens its doors completely to Chinese imports, then these Chinese imports will be redirected from the European Union to the US, just by playing with the rules of origin. Some probably will say that this is pure speculation, but I can tell you that this is what my US colleagues tell me when I meet them, and this is the discussions that they have in Washington. This is what the US industries debate when they talk to the Department on Trade in Washington. Now, I would like to come to, in fact, some illustration. So we know that some people are saying that millions of jobs is exaggerated. And I think the best illustration is just my industry. Now coming to the ceramic industry. So our organization represents employers of 200,000 jobs, so direct jobs in the European Union. And today we have two sectors protected by anti-dumping duties, tableware and ceramic tiles. These two sectors employ directly 100,000 jobs. So these are direct jobs. It's not even the indirect jobs or the machinery or the raw material suppliers that also work around us. And I think I would like to talk to you about two cases. So these two cases that we've had. The first one that you can see here is the ceramic tiles, wall and floor tiles. So the duties were imposed in 2011. And it is considered by the industry as a very effective duty, which was at a level of 36.5%. So the general duty, the one on all the companies that have cooperated, the Chinese companies, is 36.5, which for a consumer good is for us a minimum value or an important value. What we have seen is a decrease of these imports by 60%. So we went from 60 million square meters to 20 million square meters today. So a huge impact. and the industry is stable now and can invest and knows that we can believe in fair trade in the European Union. If we look at another one, which is the case of tableware, and as the ceramic tiles industry, this is an SME sector with a large number of small and medium-sized companies. In this sector, in fact, because in SME sectors it is extremely difficult to prepare a complaint already today, even if we can rely on the non-market economy status of China, it is hugely difficult to find evidence, prima facie evidence, before you go to the European Commission and before it is affected or accepted. In the case of ceramic tiles, we needed, as an illustration, 68 companies providing information on profitability, cost of goods sold, stocks, investments, everything over the last 5 years. And you need to have this verifiable, audited, etc., and then the Commission will verify in the companies on the spot. So this is what we have to do. And in the tableware industry, it took us about 6 years, in fact, to really get structured to file this complaint. And meanwhile, what you can see on the graph is that China went, so between 2004 and 2011, they went from 20% market share to 67% market share. And then the important line is very important because it shows you the correlation between the two. You can see that we lost 33,000 direct jobs in the tableware sector really in the same period. As China was increasing market share, we were losing jobs. And now we have 25,000 jobs in this sector. So duties were imposed as well. We successfully filed a complaint. Thank you. We successfully filed a complaint that was in 2010. It was then accepted. You had duties, but not as high. The final level was 17%. But first you have the definitive duties imposed after 9 months, and this is the first line that you can see with a big fall in imports from China. And these duties were at 28%, and then the professional duties, because of the political pressure, was lower, it was 17%. So you can see that imports are starting to increase again, and in fact, to really have efficient duties, we would have needed 28%. Yeah. So I will conclude. Thank you for your attention so far. I think the messages are the same as what we have heard this morning. And my main conclusion is that what we need as industry is really a transparent and thorough impact assessment from the European Commission. If the European Union believes in transparency and better regulation, they have to understand exactly what is the impact, all the impact, the economic impact of their proposal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Battier, for keeping to the time limits. The pressure on the last speaker is always higher, so well done. I can see there's a request for the floor, and I'm sure that Maria-Elena would like to say something here.
Merci aux organisateurs.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organisers. I mean, it was very important for us to hold this event here today in the European Parliament. Now, I fully agree with the fact that China shouldn't be granted market status economy today. I mean, it doesn't fulfill the criteria to be a market economy apart from anything else. So I think it's a position that we absolutely must defend in the European Parliament, because we need to defend the interests of European workers and industries. But don't get me wrong for what I'm about to say, but there is something that makes me uncomfortable in this debate. We tend to link the issue of market economy status and the issue of social and environmental dumping. Currently in the world, there are many countries that don't respect environmental and social rights. And in spite of that, they do have market economy status. And Europe has investment and free trade agreements with a lot of these countries. So, therefore, in general, I would ask industry to help us using the same arguments that they're using against granting market economy status for China, these arguments on social environmental dumping. But I would ask them to help us using these same arguments when it comes to arguing against trade agreements with countries that don't respect environmental and social standards. Here I'm talking about India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. I'm talking about several agreements that the EU has with various countries. So I'm very pleased to hear industry turning up with these social and environmental arguments. But imagine, for example, tomorrow an investment agreement is signed with China. Well, what does that mean? What would that mean? That would mean that European businesses would be able to invest in China. They would have access to Chinese capital apart from anything else. And they would also be able to produce in China with at Chinese costs, both social and environmental, and then they could re-export goods to Europe. So do you think all these businesses who are standing behind us when we're against China being granted market economy status will continue to stand behind us when we try and fight for better environmental and social standards in China? Well, I don't necessarily believe that's the case. So I think there needs to be a European responsibility which stands up for environmental and social rights, whichever partner we're talking about. So I'd like to see this debate held with regard to all the agreements that we have today in the world. Thank you.
We'll take a number of questions. We hear from Mr. Danti and Mrs. Algira, I think, and then from Jean-Paul. I'll be very brief. I wanted to say a couple of things. Firstly, I think that at last we are discussing things on TTIP, for example. We have had a number of meetings on it, perhaps 8, but we haven't discussed this subject even in plenary, and the intercommittee hasn't even managed to put it on the agenda. It's an important issue and it's urgent. Commissioner Wallström has put it on the program for the trade strategy, but this point precisely is not actually part of her program. That's MES recognition for China. I've got a document here from the Dutch presidency, and here it says quite clearly that the European Commission will put forward a proposal during the Dutch presidency to recognise MES for China. And possibly this may be subject to some conditions. Possibly. This is what is written in this Dutch presidency document. We'll be discussing this next week in plenary. I think we need to take quick steps here to put a stop to this slippage. We need to try and involve governments, public opinion and national parliaments as well, and take a position before it's too late. I think that this issue of steel is very important. We are seeing a paradox emerge now where on the one hand the Commission would like to give MES to China and therefore recognise that it's all right to subsidise industry, and then on the other hand Italy is subject to an infringement procedure in Val di Taranto because the Italian government wanted to restructure the industry, their major steel industry plant, for environmental reasons, and the Commission has come up with an infringement procedure. So it almost seems that there are double standards going on. I'd also like to pose a question to the speakers of this second panel. We need to be careful about breaking things up into different sectors. I think what the Commission will probably say is that we've got 50 cases of dumping infringements. So if we take those 50 cases in a communist economy or where the state runs the economy, it doesn't really matter what's predicted. They could take protection away from the steel sector and put the investments into another sector and carry on dumping there. So we have to watch out for a sectoral approach being adopted by the Commission. It's not enough to have limited access to certain sectors. It has to cover the whole scope.
Sul modo in cui si interviene
on what's being done on strategic sectors in Italy, well, I think during recent years some pretty bad stuff's been done. I mean, I think what's been done really shows how you can not have a strategic view of industry and how not having a strategic view can lead to problems. Europe should be looking at which direction it wants to take when it comes to industry. I know the Thyssen Group issue very well because I'm from Umbria, and I think what's going on there really shows how there is a lack of an EU strategic vision and how the lack of that vision is really causing problems. I mean, we're our own worst enemies here. Particularly if we think that if we can safeguard ourselves from external pressures by safeguarding our internal economy. I mean, we keep thinking of competition as though it was a purely internal European issue. And if we carry on doing that, then we can't deal with the competition from strong economies such as China and also the US with TTIP. All of us are trying to act individually without coming together. And the problem is there that then we have no overall view of what we're going to do with our strategic industries, our strategic sectors. I mean, people continue to think that they can act individually to resolve problems and don't come up with coordinated industrial policies. And that causes massive problems, for example, with a lack of investment, and that often leads to economic problems, but also environmental problems. I mean, then you see diseases appearing, which are caused by the industrial context, and the reason for all of that is because there hasn't been a consistent overarching view of industrial strategy. We need to have this overall view for our strategy. We need to know where we're going to go and what we want to do. Without that, we will never be able to tackle unfair competition coming from strong economies such as the Chinese one.
Well, indeed, I think that this is a particularly important debate, and we can see that there's a broad majority emerging to reject MES for China. But of course, things will continue whilst we are negotiating. China will continue to trade, carry out its investments in European Union, particularly in France, and we need to take steps on that. We've heard from a number of speakers that we need a strategic vision in Europe concerning what we want to do to combat globalization, and particularly to counter the role of China and certain emerging countries. I think that Europe and the Commission should try and come up with a strategic vision for a number of sectors. So here I'm thinking of the ceramic sector, which I know quite well. And that could well be a strategic sector, and should in fact be a strategic sector. If Europe had the desire, genuine desire, to make progress there, then I think that all European Union countries would benefit, and the European Union would show that it can be a driving force in the world's economy. we have to try and make sure that we are dominating the game.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Before I come back on that, could I just ask if the interpreters could give us an extra 10 minutes? That doesn't seem to be a problem. It's obviously always difficult for me as a trade unionist to be asking people to work longer, but I'll just give 30 seconds to the member who's asked to speak them.
Non è una domanda, è una considerazione brevissima.
It's not a question, it's just a very brief comment. I mean, we'll be discussing all these issues in the inter-committee. I mean, there'll be an extraordinary meeting being held on the 18th, and there'll be an oral question discussed there. And in addition, I am the rapporteur for trade strategy for the European Parliament, and in my document we'll be talking about recognition of MES for China, but obviously we'll have to discuss that with others before any final conclusions can be made. Thank you very much. Any colleagues want to answer? We've got till 22. And I need to conclude then, because we've got our cocktail awaiting us, and also we have to leave the room. The interpreters have very kindly agreed to give us a few extra minutes, but we have to set them free at 1:45. So, does anyone want to answer? Anyone want to respond, colleagues?
Just briefly, to me, we must this discussion on MES. To me, it's a specific problem. We must not link this to our overall relation with China. It's a minor issue. It's just about using or not using anti-dumping procedures. There's nothing to do with our overall relationship with China. And then regarding what the Commission wants to achieve, I think they want something in return, and I think this is an illusion. For China, it's evident that they get market economy status and they don't want to pay a price for it. The Commission is hoping that they will pay a price for it. I'm not convinced of that. Then, the statement of Marie, of course, as trade unions, I very much support this. Also, industry should deal with the issues of social and environmental dumping. On the other hand, in the new generation of trade agreements, there will always be a chapter on sustainable development and labor rights, but it's, of course, these are the politicians, that's not the industry. But in the meantime, there are some voluntary agreements on blood minerals, for example, together with industry. There are some initiatives. Some companies are taking their social responsibility seriously because they are also going deep in their supply chain to see if there are infringements on social rights and so on. So there is something moving, but of course I fully agree with you. And I think this must be it. Yeah. Okay, I keep it.
Yes. So very quickly, first answering the question from Mrs. Arena. So I heard once a few years ago an MEP who said that trade should not be a Swiss knife. I mean, anti-dumping, trade defense, and indeed, I mean, we have to tackle unfair trade and unfair practices. We are concerned by social dumping, but we know that it's not legally addressed by the trade defense instrument. So we have, in fact, if I can answer your question concerning, your question was very specific, would we go to China? And if you talk to an SME sector such as mine, the answer is no, because SMEs, they don't relocate, they internationalize themselves, but they don't relocate, they just die if the burden is too heavy. But your question is completely fair. This is a multi-phase issue, but today we can say that the only thing that we have, the only instrument that we have to try to fix this all unfair imbalance is trade defense. It shouldn't be like this, but it is like it is.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis désolé.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but I think we need to conclude now. So I'll try and sketch out some kind of response to what's been said without going into all the details. I share what Marielena said there. It's Industrial who's here now saying, well, help us with unfair competition with China. Will they be there tomorrow if the opposite was to happen? But here it's not about defending our own patch behind each industry, no matter who the major player it is in that, Mr. Mittal, for example, and his family. But behind that, there are jobs. Because we're talking about consumer goods, well, that involves further knock-on production and greater prosperity for everybody. And if we end up putting an end to the steel or the ceramic sectors, then that's going to cause major problems. It's not just about recognising MES in certain sectors and whether or not that's a good idea. The point is to try and show that the conditions are not met for MES recognition. China doesn't respect the same rules as us. And if tomorrow Europe were to impose its rules or social rules, or then the WTO has to be the safeguard for agreements which would be signed. If China were offside, well, or any country was offside, it would be because they were playing by the same rules. And if somebody insists on not respecting the rules, then they get disqualified from a competition. But what's happening here, if that's the way things are with China, why isn't China disqualified from the WTO? The motto of Europe is united in diversity, and we've come together to defend European citizens, and this is why we've been elected. And I agree, I'm not sure if it was David who said it, but I think that European Parliament has to be on war footing here. Take the fight to the Commission and not let the Council act on its own. We need to be careful that the member states don't end up competing amongst each other to try and get the largest share of the cake in the dealings with China. We need to safeguard the steel sector. It's a question of life and death practically in the coming weeks and months. Europe can't hold back any longer. If we want to show that the European Union can be a solution and can protect citizens' interests, we have to take a step now, rather than waiting until our political leaders end up trying to find a last-ditch solution to the problems facing the European Union citizens. Anyway, we've only just started with our debate here on this issue. Thank you very much to all of you for coming. Thank you to the experts who were willing to come and tell us about the situation. And now I'd like to invite you to come and have a drink with us, and hopefully this is a good start to combating the